The file begins. Late 2025. The digital tomb of Jeffrey Epstein was pried open, spilling its contents into the public domain. It was expected to be a posthumous audit of a known monster, an inventory of old sins. Instead, it became the prologue to a new, darker chapter for a different predator. The name, Weinstein, appeared, not as a footnote, but as a co-conspirator in a ledger of depravity previously thought separate. The public's fatigue with the Weinstein saga was replaced by a fresh wave of cold fury. This wasn't just another actress in a hotel room. This was something else entirely. The architecture of his evil, which everyone thought they understood, suddenly had a new, uncharted wing. A wing built on an island. The anatomy of this new accusation was clinical, brutal. The files contained the testimony of an accuser known only as Celia, a ghost from a different ledger. The FBI's presentation, dated from a sealed 2011 investigation, was the centerpiece. It detailed a meeting, not in a casting office, but in a Caribbean villa. The evidence wasn't about a role, it was about a transaction. The Bureau's slides methodically laid out flight manifests, financial transfers, and security logs. They painted a picture not of a predator ambushing his prey, but of two apex predators hunting in tandem. Weinstein wasn't just a guest on Epstein's island. He was a client. But a client is just a customer, and every customer has an origin story. To understand the monster in the Caribbean villa, you must first travel back to the grit and exhaust fumes of Queens. Before the private jets, there was the number 7 train. Before the NDAs, there was a father who cut diamonds, teaching his sons the value of pressure and the geometry of flaws. His name was Max. The company would bear his name and his wife's, Miramax, a monument to family that would become a mausoleum for careers. The initial blueprint was not for an empire, it was for a hustle, promoting rock concerts in Buffalo. The brothers, Harvey and Bob, learned their first lesson not in cinema, but in crowd control. In the raw economics of the velvet rope. They didn't sell art, they sold access. Their first films were foreign objects, curiosities no one else would touch. They bought them cheap. They sold them with a narrative of genius. Their genius. The shine of Miramax wasn't from the silver screen. It was the reflection of their own brutal ambition, polished with the desperation of others. The hustle became a system. The anatomy of the fall begins with the architecture of power. Miramax stopped just distributing films. It started making them. This was the pivotal mutation. The moment the gatekeeper became the kingmaker. And the king. His throne room was often a hotel suite, his scepter a telephone, his decrees delivered in a rage that could curdle blood. The legend of Harvey Scissorhands was born here. It was never about making a film better. It was an act of public neutering. A message to the entire ecosystem that the final cut, the final word, belonged to him. He built a stable of talent, but they were not partners. They were assets. Their loyalty was a currency he minted and spent freely. The price of a career was fealty. The price of disobedience was exile. The system had a name. It was called Hollywood. He just perfected its darkest bylaws. The parties were glittering traps. The champagne was a sedative. The entire industry became complicit through its silence, its ambition, its desperate need to be inside the room where the deals were made. While one brother built the brand, the other managed the fallout. A perfect division of labor. One collected the souls, the other buried the evidence. But burying evidence is a full-time job. It requires resources. It demands loyalty. For years, the whispers were just that. Rumors traded in hushed tones at industry parties, dismissed as the sour grapes of failed actresses or ambitious rivals. The first real tremors were not stories in the press. They were legal documents, an inventory of sins filed under seal. Each accusation, a potential wildfire. Each settlement, a bucket of water mixed with gasoline. Pause Rose McGowan. Pause Ambra Gutierrez. Pause Zelda Perkins. Names that would one day become rallying cries were once just line items in a ledger of liabilities. The strategy was brutally simple: isolate, intimidate, and pay. The non-disclosure agreement became his most effective weapon, a paper cage where truth went to die. It wasn't just about money. It was about buying a person's future silence, turning their trauma into a legally binding secret. A fatal miscalculation was made. They assumed the secrets would stay buried. They forgot that paper burns and digital records are forever. This was not the work of one man. It was the product of an ecosystem, an entire infrastructure of complicity, built on fear and fueled by ambition. The enablers were everywhere. They were the agents who stopped returning calls, the lawyers who drafted contracts that were more like shackles, the publicists who spun tales of consensual encounters, the journalists who traded a difficult story for continued access to the palace. This was the anatomy of the cover-up. A conspiracy of silence where everyone played their part for a piece of the kingdom. They were not evil men. They were practical. They had mortgages to pay, careers to build, and their own proximity to power to protect. Each ignored phone call, each killed story, each piece of advice to just let it go was a brick in the wall of his fortress. Pause. The fortress wasn't built to keep others out. It was built to keep the truth in. And the verdict, when it finally came, was not just for him. It was a sentence for the entire glittering, rotten machine that he had perfected. But a machine leaves behind schematics, a paper trail written in the ink of complicity. Post-verdict forensic audits unearthed something they called the library. It wasn't a room, but a system, a digital coffin for inconvenient truths, managed by a select few. Internal communications, stripped of their corporate jargon, revealed the code. Arrange a meeting at the peninsula was not a scheduling request. It was a summons. Needs career guidance was the flag for a woman deemed difficult. The most damning were the spreadsheets. Not of film budgets, but of people. Columns for name, project, level of ambition, and a final chilling column labeled containment strategy. This was the inventory of sins. It detailed payoffs disguised as consulting fees, funneled through shell corporations with names that sounded like B-movie production houses. It listed non-disclosure agreements that were less legal documents and more like psychological shackles, drafted with a precision designed to break a person's will to speak. One internal memo regarding a settlement for an unnamed actress is the system's bitter testament. It simply reads, "The asset is secured. The narrative is controlled." Pause. The asset was a human being. The narrative was a lie. The narrative is a ghost that haunts the survivors. These are the crippled fates. The names that never made the spreadsheets because they simply vanished. For every famous face that testified, there are 100 silhouettes who lost their careers before they began. They were actresses, writers, assistants. They arrived in Hollywood with a script in their bag and a fire in their eyes. They left with a hollowed-out feeling and the cold understanding of how the machine works. Their fatal error was not ambition, it was belief. They believed the agent who said, "Don't rock the boat." They believed the lawyer who advised a quiet settlement. They believed the lie that their career was more fragile than one man's reputation. This was the true meat grinder of fame. It didn't just chew up dreams, it digested them, turning hope into the quiet acid of regret. One woman, now a real estate agent in Ohio, was told she had the perfect look for a role. Pause. She never worked in film again. Her story is not unique. It is the wallpaper of that gilded cage, a pattern of broken promises and futures traded for silence. But silence has a price, and the bill always comes due. The noise began not as a roar, but as a series of whispers in a sterile courtroom. The kingmaker, once draped in bespoke suits, smelling of victory and expensive cologne, was now a defendant. His new uniform was off the rack and reeked of desperation. The anatomy of the fall was a public spectacle. Each day in court was a meticulous dismantling of a myth. His walker, the clunky metal prop he leaned on, was a more honest trophy than any golden statue he had ever clutched. Pause. It was a testament to gravity, the gravity of his crimes, the gravity that pulls all aging bodies toward the earth. The verdict, when it came, was not a surprise. It was an inventory of sins finally tallied. The numbers read aloud were not just years. They were a currency of stolen youth, of shattered careers, of silenced voices being converted back into the only thing the system understands. Pause. Time. His empire, the Weinstein Company, became an obelisk of ruin on the skyline of his own history. A monument to rot. The final chapter is not written in a courtroom. It is written in the suffocating quiet of a 6 by 9 foot cell. This is his final legacy. Not the reels of celebrated film, but the cold concrete of his final residence. A tomb for a living man. He who once commanded armies of lawyers and publicists now has an audience of one. The face in the polished steel mirror. There is a unique loneliness reserved for deposed kings. It is the silence after the applause has died. A silence so profound it becomes a physical presence. The bitter testament of his story is not that a monster was caged. It is that the cage was built by a system that still stands. The machinery of power he so expertly manipulated just recalibrated. It found new fuel. His name became a cautionary tale whispered in green rooms and boardrooms, a password for a new, more subtle kind of compliance. His true sentence is not the years, it is the irrelevance. To be a ghost haunting the ruins of his own name. Pause. A footnote in the very history he thought he was writing.